You are listening to the Terroir podcast on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon.
All right, welcome back to the Terroir podcast. My name is Emily Monaco. I am a food expert and a culinary journalist based here in Paris.
And I am Wine Dine Caroline. I am a wine teacher in Lyon. And yeah, I also do wine retreats on lots of fun stuff. And I'm so happy to be here with you, Emily, and our special guest.
Hi, my name is Christian Holthausen. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm a Franco-American based in Paris. I'm the founder of Westbrook Marketing Partners, working with a variety of wineries and wine journalists with a focus on Champagne, but also in other parts of the world as well. And I'm really happy to be here with both Emily and Caroline.
And last week, we kind of took you all through a little bit of the history behind Champagne, kind of the what's old in Champagne. But Champagne is not stuck in the past. And that's something that we're really excited to chat with Christian about. So there are lots of new exciting things and new issues that we have to face in Champagne. One of which I think maybe one of the big ticket issues is, of course, climate change, which is affecting wine regions all over the world. But I think that there are some special challenges, some enjeux in Champagne specifically. So can you tell us a little bit about how climate change is affecting the process of making Champagne and changing it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like every single part of the world, Champagne is seeing the results of climate change. As the northernmost wine-producing region in France, historically, Champagne has always had very high acidity and low pH, the potential of hydrogen levels due to the cool temperatures. But every single one of the earliest harvests in the history of the appellation has taken place in the 21st century, starting with 2003. So we're now really struggling to maintain acidity, and pH levels are rising. So reduction in acidity and an increase in pH levels at the same time potentially creates wines that really lack freshness. And additionally, higher pH wines can also tend to oxidize at a higher rate and not age as well. So that's sort of the global warming piece of climate change. But as you both know as well as I do, it's not just a question of rising temperatures. We're seeing really unstable peaks and valleys in the viticultural cycle. We just had it again last week. We have warm spring temperatures followed by really cruel frost. We have really intense hailstorms. The hydric stress on the vines due to a lack of water is a real problem as well. So these are, several of the things facing the Champenois at the moment. And I think it's really important that we take every opportunity we have to draw more attention to this, but also just to climate change in general. I think we've all reached a point where we're tired of the greenwashing. I want to know concretely, what are you doing? What am I consuming? And how can I, as an individual, make a difference as well?
So I love everything you just said, Christian. And I think it really is worth, explaining to everybody that in the wine industry, climate change is not controversial. It's also not negotiable. Nobody's pretending it's not happening because we see it every day. And when, you talk about crazy weather events like this hot moment we had a few weeks ago and then followed by cold weather, what that means in really basic terms is that basically the vines think it's earlier than it is, or it's later than it is, right? The vines think that it's time to bloom. And if they bloom, if any sort of flower buds come out, that's what's going to become the grapes. And if there's a frost after that, that's when you lose your crop. We saw that last year, all throughout Burgundy, Beaujolais. This year again, when you see these images online of these candles burning in the vineyard, that's to try to protect the buds that have already burst. So it really is a real crop loss issue that is so important. It's such a nuanced thing. And I do think it's really interesting when you talked about harvest dates, because harvest dates are actually something that have been recorded for 1,000 years in Burgundy, really at least hundreds of years, and in Champagne for a very long time. So it's this real concrete proof we have that we are harvesting earlier and earlier because the grapes are riper sooner after hotter summers.
Yeah, and I'm curious too what you were saying about freshness, Christian. I think freshness is something that we're always seeking in Champagne, and I feel like, but I could have misinterpreted this. I read something about how it used to be that you would add new harvest wine to get freshness, and that these days it's almost the opposite, that we're looking for the the aged wine to add freshness to new harvest wine. Is that have I got that completely wrong?
Well, in Champagne, traditionally for non-vintage wines, we used to add older wines, reserve wines, to sort of add richness and complexity to the younger base wine. Because the younger base wines, they used to be so full of acidity, they would really kind of rip the enamel off your teeth when you consumed them. And so you needed older wines. Now people are finding different ways to use reserve wines in order to freshen them. I mean, you have some producers that are now aging reserve wines in magnums under cork and staple. You have people doing reserve wines in Solera formats, but that's one of several different ways that the Champenois are trying to retain freshness in their wines.
What other techniques are we seeing them, employing besides obviously harvesting sooner, which is to a certain point, you still need ripeness.
Yeah, and we can't really harvest, that much sooner because, as you know, that's not always the only factor. I mean, I think that there's a few things that are going on. So people are definitely playing around with how they're aging reserve wines and using them as a way to sort of add freshness. Pretty much everyone is blocking malolactic fermentation in Champagne because it's no longer necessary to convert that harsh acidic, malic acid into the creamy lactic acid. We need the opposite of that now. One of the things I think is quite cool is lots of people are experimenting with what we call the forgotten varieties of Champagne, all of them being white, so Alban, Petit Meslier, Pinot Blanc, and Pinot Gris, to see if they're more resistant to climate change. Everyone always talks about Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier, but it might only be less than 1% of the appellation, but 1% of the appellation is planted with these 4 other varieties. Some early studies have suggested that Arbonne and Petit Meslier might even benefit from warmer temperatures. So I think we're going to see the incorporation of some of these varieties. A lot of really cool producers like Tarlon, like Layard, are already working with these. Drapier are working with some of the older varieties. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. And something that I think is quite scary, if you think about it long term, is there's been a real rise in interest and production of Coteaux Champenois, which are still wines from Champagne. So essentially a still Pinot Noir or a still Chardonnay. They've always been quite cool and quite trendy and niche, and basically you could only taste them if you were visiting at a house. But lots and lots of producers, big and small, are now making these. And in 30 or 40 or 50 years, I mean, if we don't get the climate situation under control, will we be able to make sparkling wine in Champagne?
Well, that's a super interesting question. And I think we're going to talk a lot about sort of what the possibilities are and whether Champagne is even going to be able to, A, whether you can make it, and B, whether it's going to maintain the sort of cachet that it has. But I am curious about the varietals you were talking about, because I know that there are other regions like Bordeaux that are experimenting with adding other varieties. Would those be allowed into the AOP as it stands right now?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated one. One of the organizations that I'm very, very involved in is the International Wineries for Climate Action, and this comes up a bit. So IWCA was started by the Torres family in Spain and Jackson Family Wines in California in 2019, and the idea is really to galvanize the global wine industry to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate as it impacts the vineyard and the winery. And so this topic comes up now in every single wine region in the world. In a lot of European regions, I mean, laws have been really, really strict. You can only use these 3 or 4 grape varieties. You are not allowed to irrigate. You cannot bottle before this date. And, there's lots of regions now where people are saying, but maybe I need to employ different grapes. Maybe I need to adhere to a different calendar. And then you have backlash from people saying, oh, but then it's not going to be Burgundy. Then it's not going to be Bordeaux. Then it's not going to be Sancerre. But at the same time, you have wineries saying, yes, but it's not just us being lazy. I mean, they're not looking to, acidify their wines. They're not looking to do anything really horrible. But it's how can we sort of adapt how we farm? And where is the split between the respect for tradition and, the real desire, but also need to innovate in order to survive?
Well, I think this is this sort of really French issue, is that we are so steeped in mythology, a lot of which is nonsense. I mean, it's just not real. You mentioned Sancerre. Sancerre is basically looks the way it looks because of phylloxera. They weren't growing Sauvignon Blanc in Sancerre. They were growing Pinot Noir. They planted Sauvignon Blanc because it was more resistant to phylloxera. All these regions have been evolving. They have been innovating. We are we are currently very wrapped in an idea of French wine as being this immutable, unchanging thing, which is so not true. And so it is heartening to see places like Bordeaux, including grapes that are more resistant to heat. And also people are starting to look at hybrids. I mean, I don't know, Christian, if you've ever had the chance to taste any random hybrid wines from America, but so I was in Illinois and tasted a traditional method champagne style sparkling wine from the Illinois Sparkling Company that uses Chardonnay, Frontenac, and La Crosse, which are all hybrids. And it was really good. So it's really interesting, that this is a place where, they're using hybrids because it's too cold. It's the opposite problem. But can we use different grapes to get the desired result? And eventually, are we going to have to?
I think I'm all for experimentation. I'm all for sharing information. I'm all for sharing best practices. I'm all for trial and error. But I think that we need to approach this. I also don't think it was the implication, but just so everyone's clear, that's listening to us, I don't think it's fair to say it's a French issue. I mean, this is a very similar issue in Spain. It's a very similar issue in Italy. It's a very similar issue in sort of prestigious parts of the New World as well. I mean, this sort of how far is too far and what do we need to do? Which is, again, I think why a lot of groups like International Wineries for Climate Action, and there's many others now, people coming together to say, hey, we might be on opposite sides of the world, but, I could be in New Zealand, you might be on the Côte Blanc in Champagne, you might be in California, but, how can we share knowledge? And I think that's really one of the positive things is we're really reaching out to people from around the world now to help each other, because climate change affects every single one of us, not just wine producers, but like everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, specifically in Champagne, I think that we're seeing some rising trends that I'm curious to know if they're a result of climate change, if they're a result of something else. All of these sort of innovations that we're seeing, and one that I think has taken over and has become this trend that I think is largely misunderstood, a lot like a lot of other wine trends, like low sugar wines, but this one specifically pertains to Champagne, which is this idea of zero dosage. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and kind of why people are so excited about it right now?
Yeah, it's funny because there's a lot of kind of threads like looping into what created this issue / problem. But historically, dosage was added, following the aging, riddling, and disgorgement process before the final cork was placed in and the wine was made available for sale. So dosage is actually a mixture of sugar and reserve wines, but it often gets reduced to just sugar. And the range goes from doux, which is more than 50 grams of sugar and reserve wines per liter, down to a brut nature pas dosé au dosage zéro, which is anything less than 3 grams. But in between, you have demi-sec, sec, extra brut, going all the way down. So again, going back a generation or two ago, dosage levels were much higher because, the climate was very, very different. And, the consumption of champagne was very, very different. Whereas now we don't need more sugar in the wine. We're actually looking for ways to, keep it fresh, clean, pure. So I think one of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of different things have, again, threads have conflated, is that you don't need as much sugar in wine, which is why naturally even big, massive commercial producers are reducing the dosage in their wines. So that's just sort of fact of way it is. At the same time, there's been this like trend of the anti-sugar mafia. And some people started saying lesser dosage meant considerably less calories. Every single year, some ridiculous fashion magazine from somewhere, and it could be anywhere, it's a variety of countries, rings me up and wants to interview me about how can you drink alcohol for the holidays and not gain weight? And it always comes down to this like, well, zero dosage has less calories in it, therefore it's healthier for you. And I'm like, listen, if you're looking to lose weight, like cut back on the alcohol amongst other things. The difference between, 0 gram per litre and 3 grams or 5 grams, we're not talking about a huge caloric thing. So at some point, sugar has kind of become this like horrible like enemy, that like the enemy of the state. And so I think that now you have all of these people that know a little bit about wine, but not as much as they think they know. And they kind of evaluate the quality level of a champagne by its dosage. Like you'll go to a big consumer wine tasting and you'll have these guys that will come around and be like, oh, what's the dosage on that? And you'll be like, this is 5 grams. Oh, way too high, way too high. It's always guys. And I'm always like, and I'm like, why do you think that? And they're like, oh, for me, the best dosage is always 2 grams. And I'm like, well, it depends. Are you making sparkling wine in the Côte d'Ivoire? Are you making it on the Côte Blanc? Are you making it in Tasmania? Are you making it in Trento? Like those are, it's not really that hard and fast. So I think the zero dosage thing is very trendy in a lot of ways, but it's kind of masking a lot of really, complicated conversations that need to take place. Because it's become so reductive. You can't judge a quality of its wine just by its dosage. The dosage is like this little touche that you do like at the end of the process. It's not really that important.
Thank you so much for being the voice of reason in an industry where there is a lot of bullshit. Amen. I agree with you 100%. And it is always a dude, isn't it?
Always. Yeah, no, I think it's not, you can't just judge something. I mean, I'm interested, how are you farming? Like, are you using herbicides? Are you using pesticides? Like, how are you treating your staff? I'd like to know, I love B Corp and I'm, supporting some producers that are making the transition to that now. I want to know how your workers are being treated, their health. Are men and women being represented equally and paid equally? Is there a level of focus on diversity? And then maybe 100 other things. And then finally we can get to dosage. But dosage for me, as someone that's worked in Champagne for the last 20 years, is not for me this like end all be all indicator of quality. I think there's a lot bigger fish to fry than dosage.
Preach. Are you planning a romantic trip to Paris? Make sure to listen to Romancing in Paris, our podcast on the Paris Underground Radio by Lily Heiss. Now it's time for a word from our sponsors. Now, back to the Terroir podcast. Well, I think that, you actually touched on something really interesting because we are talking a lot about climate change these days in the wine industry, but we're also talking about diversity and representation. And it's something that comes up a lot in Champagne, that we talk a lot about women in Champagne, but we're talking about dead women from a long time ago who were awesome, bad bitches. Obviously we talked about them last week. So, can you tell us a little bit about what diversity in Champagne looks like today, what women's roles are now, and what steps Champagne is taking on those fronts?
I mean, I'm all about giving voice to anyone and everyone. And it's true that those famous widows of Champagne, from, La Veuve Clicquot to Louise Palmery to Lily Boulanger, they all were extraordinary and deserve to be revered and respected. And it's important that we don't forget their stories. I think my frustration is that often the conversation stops right there. And I think we need to have more focus on what the women of today are doing in Champagne. Look at the incredible wines that Julie Caville has been making at Krug for years. Look at a vigneron like Melanie Tarlon, who a decade ago was one of the only people in Champagne learning how to do social media and then teaching others to do it. I want to know about those stories. And there's hundreds more stories like that. So I think that we have a tendency to give respect to the widows in a few minutes, and then we just sort of move on to today, and there isn't as much focus on women in general. And again, there's not really as much of a focus on the Champagne conversation about diversity in general. Women and I'll just throw myself in there, homosexual men, we have a tendency to get relegated to the marketing and public relations roles much more frequently than we get into the managing director, chef de cave roles. There's also a complete absence of cultural diversity, considering how important the Champagne and Bordeaux markets are to various parts of the world, including the United States and China and Japan. I'd like to see people from those countries participating at different levels of the process as well. And I think that, things are moving forward and we're having different conversations now than we were having even 5 years ago, and certainly different conversations than a generation ago. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but I think any opportunity that people like us that have platforms have to be able to talk about, hey, what's going on now? What can we do to make things better now is really, really important. Let's talk about the 18th century, but my God, it's like when you used to visit Champagne and you sit in a room with a pretty 24-year-old boy or girl and you talk about the 18th century and caviar. And it's like, that's great, but that doesn't represent my Champagne today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this weird imbalance between the history and the tradition, which, Caroline and I delve into every single week on this show, and talking about tradition and talking about, what is rooted in this area. But there are a lot of things that are evolving and changing, and there are a lot of things that people are uncomfortable to face. And one of the things that I think we've been hearing a lot recently that isn't necessarily that much to do with Champagne, but to do with kind of looking outside of Champagne. Maybe goes back to the climate, maybe goes to us sort of being willing to try something that doesn't have that long established history and sort of revered, I don't know, this is almost kingly Champagne, which is that we're looking at other regions making fantastic sparkling wines, sort of starting to say, hey, can this compete with Champagne? And I'm sort of curious, A, is it fair to position them in that way? And B, is there any sort of truth to people saying, well, the UK, they're making better Champagne than Champagne now?
I mean, you know me well. I'm a postmodern, kid of the majored in feminist theory in the 90s. Like, I hate false dichotomies, like, more than anything. And I feel like comparing things is always really, really limiting. I mean, Champagne in the 80s and 90s was given the initially seductive impression that climate change was going to be positive because it started getting warmer, and the 80s and 90s produced a lot of really good vintages in Champagne. But then it's gotten so warm that it's hard to stop. In England, by the end of the 20th century, the same phenomenon had moved to the north, and lots of people were starting to plant grapes in England. Grapes are now planted in England, Scotland, Wales, and the Channel Islands. The entire wine category in the UK is up to 10 million bottles, and 2/3 of that is devoted to sparkling, most of it Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier. What's really interesting about visiting the UK now is they're talking about their wines without comparing themselves to Champagne. 10 years ago, when you went for a visit at an English producer, most of them would put out this map and talk about this chalky seam that ran from Champagne through the English Channel into Kent and Sussex. And they'd spend the first 5 minutes talking about how they were just as good as Champagne, or they beat some Champagne in a blind tasting, etc. But that's really stopped, and that's really good. I think it makes sense because as a newer production center of wine, they were comparing themselves to this benchmark. It reminds me a bit about Oregon, like 25 years ago. You used to go to Oregon 25 years ago, and they would essentially give you the same thing. They'd say, if you look at a map, we have the same latitude as Burgundy, which is why we're experts at Pinot Noir. But that doesn't happen anymore either. So I think that let's look at excellent producers everywhere to see what they're doing. But I don't think we can sort of compare region to region anymore. I think it's much more complicated than that.
I think that's really an interesting perspective because, I got my start in wine in London. So I was working in the wine industry in London in 2010. And I remember, oh my God, I'm old. I remember English wine, starting to be a thing in London, but really starting because, and we talk about this a lot and we repeat it again, it takes a long time for a wine region to come up in the world. Like, it takes like 30 years, 40 even. So these are people who've been working on it for a couple decades, and they're finally starting to actually come into their own. But I definitely do remember that was always number one thing. Oh, and this Kimmeridgian clay that comes up from Champagne, and it's the same, and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, the wines are excellent, but they're not Champagne because, again, it comes back to this whole thing of terroir. English terroir is not the same as the terroir in Champagne. The people are different and everything is different, but it is a really cool category. But even though the climate being a little warmer gives them some room to get the ripeness that they couldn't get 100 years ago, or that they were interested in getting 100 years ago, they still have the fucked up weather. And the fucked up weather is what destroys, an entire season of a crop too. Like, it's just, it doesn't, there's no universe where any of this benefits wine. I mean, it's just going to kill wine. It's going to kill it completely. It's going to kill all food. So goodbye. I'm going to go jump off the bridge now into the Rhone since there's no more food left in the world.
But again, I think it's about working together. Like, again, to go back to the false dichotomy thing, like, I hate Napa versus Bordeaux, I hate Cava versus Prosecco, and I hate English versus Champagne. There are good producers and mediocre producers everywhere in the world. And it used to be a generation ago that a simple appellation place name was regarded as this marker of quality. And let's be honest, a lot of people kind of got lazy because that was just kind of an automatic indicator. Like, once someone said they were from Pauillac, once someone said they were from Meunier-sur-Roger, the conversation kind of stopped there, and I was like, well, God, I guess I can't say anything more. Whereas now there's people making great wines and less great wines, like, everywhere. And I think that for me, I look at producers. I always get asked as a Champagne guy, like, do I drink, non-Champagnes? And if I was confronted with, a champagne versus English sparkling wine, which would I pick? And I'm like, well, it depends on the producer. Like, I love Gasborne in England. I think those wines are great. I love Ferrari from Trento in Italy. I love Reventos and Recaredo from Spain. I like what Michael Cruz is doing out in Petaluma. Like, I think that there's a lot of really cool sparkling producers, and I don't think it's fair to Champagne or fair to the rest of the world to have to compare them to each other. Why not have all the cool producers, all of those work together to, make the conversation larger and bring more people into the conversation and address things like climate change and diversity and trial and experimentation. I think we really need to make it much more open and much more about connecting with as many people as possible.
I love that. I love everything you just said. And I so agree with you. And it's funny because I feel like civilians think that because we're in the wine industry that we are going to be assholes about this stuff. But people are like, oh, what's your favorite wine? I'm like, whatever's in my glass. Like, you give me a bottle of Gasborne and a bottle of Krug. Like, I'll be happy to taste them both, Like, let's
them both
let's have a party.
Yeah.
That's funny. No, I love that. Yeah, they're different. And this again, why does it have to be better?
And there's also better wines for better moments as well, and better times of year and better times of the day. So again, I don't like this reductive, nature of it, because it's let's really compare things, not based on a number or based on where they happen to fall on a latitudinal or longitudinal line, because it's much more complicated than that.
Well, it's definitely more complicated than that. And I mean, I think we have lots of different pieces of this puzzle and lots of different sort of reputations at stake, almost like people who think that something is quality and it's not, people who think that something is bad when it might be good. I'm curious about the role of the co-op in Champagne, because I feel like we've talked about co-ops on this podcast before. We've talked about how they got their unfortunate reputation. But I mean, do co-ops make up a lot of Champagne? And is it necessarily a good or a bad sign when we're talking about co-ops in Champagne these days?
Why don't we just remind the listeners, because we haven't heard about co-ops since last season, what a co-op is.
Oh, right.
And I know, a little language barrier sometimes. Well, there are co-ops in America, but a co-op is when multiple viticultures, so wine growers, grape growers, basically invest in a winery together, and they co-own the winery, and then the winery has winemakers and staff and basically makes and then markets and sells the wine. Is that the same? Is that correct in Champagne as well, Christian?
Yeah, I think that's kind of universal, not just for wine, but also for other cooperatives like cheese. I mean, there's amazing cheese cooperatives. I think there's cooperatives all over the place, but that's essentially, more or less the business model. Right now, I think there's this wonderful generational shift happening. I mean, I'm 47. My parents used to think of cooperatives in general, not in Champagne, but just in general, as these places where all grapes were just kind of thrown into this blending tank and it was vinified like ASAP and then sold off at a cheap price. And I think there were definitely some cooperatives all over the world, not just in terms of wine, but food as well, that's exactly what was taking place. But what's cool in Paris is that people in their 20s are really interested in cooperatives, not just for the wine, but for the cheese, for chocolate, for vegetables. And I think it's this idea of working together, supporting each other as a collective. In Champagne, there's always this ridiculous debate about which is better, the négociants or the houses, or the Récoltants Manipulants, the growers. And it's always like, are you more of a house guy or more of a grower guy? And it's like, stop, that's absurd, because you know what you're missing? In the middle of what you think are those extremes, there's the entire world of the coopérative. And a lot of cooperatives are actually producing very, very excellent wine. So I think that the cooperative category needs to be reassessed and explored more fully. There was a tasting this past week in Champagne where sort of lots of people come and spend different moments at the various salons sort of tasting the Vin Clair of last year. And this year there was a group of cooperatives that actually got together, and I thought it was quite cool because they were trying to open up the conversation even more.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Terroir podcast, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. The Terroir podcast will be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Now, back to the Terroir podcast.
I love that modernity. And I also love this character that you've created of the guy. I feel like he's the guy who like tells me that I'm wrong when I order wine, or like tells me that I'm wrong. I had a guy correct me on my pronunciation of Reims and tell me it was Reims the other day, and that was fun.
Oh, I love that. Well,
Yeah.
that is worth mentioning. So, like I said, I learned all about wine in England. And in England, they call Reims Reims. But here, we really just call it,
Yeah.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, we all know that guy. His
Okay.
name is Brad.
It's probably
No,
Brad.
I don't think we need to name him. I think he's just this energy. He takes human form. Like it could be anywhere from Melbourne to like Stockholm. He just like shows up on the scene, and he's there.
And he's always in khakis.
Definitely in khakis.
I wish khakis. Well, that's true.
But so we have, lots of things that are obviously changing for a variety of reasons in Champagne. We've talked about climate change. We've talked about a change in sort of what people want generationally from their wine and from their producers. But obviously, we have not brought in the giant elephant in the room, which is the pandemic. What has the effect of the pandemic been?
Dun, dun, dun.
I think we have to remember one thing about Champagne, and I talk about him a lot because he's sort of an important person that basically affected the entire way that Champagne developed as a region, but also as a category. The very first king of France was Clovis, and he was crowned in Champagne in the 5th century. And ever since then, we've always been the wine of kings, but also the king of wines, and through the centuries become associated with celebration, and for a large number of people throughout the world, success, status, luxury, etc. So whenever there's a moment of anxiety of any kind, Champagne sales drop. It happened in 2008 during the financial crisis. It happened in 2001 after September 11th. It happened during the Gulf War or the early 90s. Like there's always this drop in Champagne because think of where we were in 2020 when Champagne sales really, really dropped. The United States, which has now become the number one market for volume and value as of last year. Prior to that, it was number one in volume, but not in value. The president of the United States at the time was, in the middle of putting these really crazy tariffs on French products. So there was that was thrown in. Plus, people were very anxious about their health, about killing, people they love. So when you think of all the symbols surrounding Champagne for most people, obviously that wasn't the moment that people were going to be drinking Champagne. I can remember doing a tasting for the house I was working with at the time, Piper Heidsieck, in 2008. We were doing a tasting with a chef in Paris, and there was a table sitting next to us, and we were two young guys drinking Champagne, and they were like, "Oh my God, how can you afford Champagne?" Because just this idea that you would see two people out drinking Champagne after the financial crisis had just happened, and I was like, "Oh, because this is our winery and we're trying to taste it and do stuff." But so I think we always have to remember that. So 2020 and 21, but definitely 2020 was tough and the category suffered. Think of Champagne consumption. There was a loss of travel. So all the duty free, restaurants, nightclubs, weddings, corporate parties. It was really tough. The good news is that after a real drop in sales in 2020, 2021 finished the year with 322 million bottles of Champagne sold. That represents an increase of 32% versus 2020. And 322 million bottles is the highest volume of Champagne bottles sold from the appellation since 2011, when the appellation sold 323 million bottles. So we're literally a million bottles off of where we were in 2011.
What do we think that's about? Is it just oh my God, we survived?
I think there's part of that. I think there's this I can hug my friend again. I can kiss my mother again. I can get on a plane again. I can go to an office again. I can go to the theater again. I can, volunteer again. I think there's a lot of things. And it's always, we're blessed and cursed with that in Champagne. I think blessed more than cursed, but will always be associated with, celebration and happiness and happy times. And again, that goes back to the 5th century. It's always been a thing. But the Champagne sales are definitely back. Obviously a lot of it was bolstered by home consumption, but now things are open again. And I think a lot of people, some of my closest friends in the world, that live in the same city, I didn't see for over a year. Man, let's break out the fucking champagne, right?
Seriously.
Absolutely. I don't, and I said this in last week, I've actually, and please don't hate me for this, I've never been to Champagne. I'm not like obsessed with it. And I know there's a lot of people in wine who are obsessed with it. And I think I need to come and visit you and become obsessed with it because it's such an incredible category and it's so interesting. But it's something that I really only drink, like at a holiday. I don't buy it a lot, but when I do, because it's also, I feel a little bit out of my element. And so I don't buy it a lot, but when I do, I definitely spend good money on it. When I do buy it, I'm buying something expensive. And so I wonder if maybe I'm one of those people that is a little scared of it and that I need to sort of branch out because obviously there are different price points too. Like I'm sure you can get, and it's certainly living in France, I can get good champagne that's under, 30 euros, right?
Well, you have the champagne category, of last year. I mean, 180 million of those bottles were sold export and 142 were sold in France. So France is still a massive amount of champagne consumption, but it's a volume market as opposed to a value market. So a lot of producers seek to really drive their value strategy on the export markets. Of the export markets now, the largest is the US. But just think of this for a second on the way into responding to your question. Like France is 142 million bottles of champagne a year. The US is now the largest export market, 34 million. The UK, 30 million. Japan, 14 million. Germany, 11 million. I mean, France still dominates champagne consumption for sure. I think that in champagne sales in France, obviously there's the power of the Grande Surface. So there's the power of that. A lot of champagne is channeled through there. And you can actually find a lot of really good deals at places like Leclerc and like Monoprix. Like, believe it or not, like they have like, really good deals on a lot of champagnes there. Also in France, people buy champagne direct from the grower a lot. Every single person is like, ah, je connais un mec, or je connais un champenois, je connais... Like every single person like knows someone. And, people from France, from Belgium, from Germany, they drive out to Champagne like in June with the car and just buy like 5 or 6 cases there and then just, drive home. I mean, that happens like all the time. And that's obviously a huge amount of the sales coming from France. But yeah, I mean, I think there's champagne at all different price points. I think that one of the things that kind of keeps champagne masked in this world of luxury and kind of secrecy is that there's a lot of people in Champagne that to this day still don't like to call it wine. Most of us do. Most people do. But there's a lot of people that are like, no, it's not wine, it's champagne. And they want to kind of keep it this secret and they want to kind of keep it this magical, mystical kind of thing. And of course, it has a rich history, but I think that it should be about tasting things and experiencing them and not just that it's this secret thing. Because if we keep it in this like secret world where we can't actually call it wine, then I think we have less people that are wine experts and lovers like yourself all the time you've been in France that you haven't come to the region yet. So I think like let's make it something that's like a little bit more easy to interpret. I mean, one of the things in Champagne that's really cool quite now is this development of onotourisme. I mean, wine tourism in Champagne is really on the up. And if you look at like Napa or you look at like the Barossa Valley, I mean, they've been doing wine tourism properly for like a really long time. England does wine tourism like really, really well. For years, the only visits in Champagne were like the ones in Reims or Epernay, where you talked about caviar and hand riddling. But now there's a lot more going on. As I said, people want to come to the vineyards, but there's also bed and breakfast. There's also specialized tour guides, a lot of them that do bike tours, that do, everything, that specifically want to visit cool, small, funky producers that are experimenting and doing different stuff in the middle of the countryside. It used to be people would take the train to Reims or the train to Epernay. They'd visit 2 producers there, then they'd head back to Paris. Now people want to spend like a couple of days there. There's like really cool restaurants. There's really cool like wine bars. There's a lot more openness. So I think Champagne is becoming much more accessible.
I would love to go and to experience that because what you said about like Napa and Barossa is interesting because it is here I'm right between Beaujolais and the Northern Rhone and like Beaujolais is not clued in to wine tourism at the moment. It's getting better. There's a couple wine tour operators who will take you from Lyon to Beaujolais, but there's not really a clear route. It's hard to Google to figure out who speaks English and this and that. There are not a ton of like amazing restaurants. It's just not. Even Burgundy, I think, is more clued in, but even Burgundy, like you need an appointment. You need, you have to be somebody to be welcomed in Burgundy. And so it's cool to see somewhere like Champagne really working to make it more accessible and to make tourism a bigger, part of the economy, because it is part of the joy of wine is going to visit the vineyards and to like be there and experience the terroir and experience the wine production side of things.
Oh, a generation ago, you would go to Champagne. There were maybe 20 houses that were open, some of them very, very, very good. But you would go in and it was very formal and someone was wearing a suit and a tie, and you did not go to the vineyards for sure. And the food was essentially going to be oysters to start, of course, and then a bit of lobster, great. And then biscuit de Reims and call it a day. But no one was talking about, what was happening in the vineyard. But that's changing a lot, because a lot of those storied houses are some of the ones that go back to the 18th century. And it's thanks to those visits where there was a visitor center, where there was a gift shop, where there was someone that spoke, German and Mandarin and Japanese and Spanish and Italian, that, people would come and visit, and they would visit those big houses and they would learn about Champagne in their own language. And then they would go home and talk to people about it. And now here we are like 2 centuries later, and people are interested in visiting them and visiting smaller producers. So yeah, it has definitely become a lot more open, but I think it took us a little bit of time to get there. And I think some regions are definitely ahead of others for sure.
Yeah, and I think that openness and accessibility obviously is coming through in the wine tourism and in the actual physical accessibility of these places to people. But I think that there's also, I don't know if de-dramatization is the right word, but I'm seeing in the US specifically, although I might be blind to something else, people who are getting creative with pairings of, some of these top-notch wines, and Champagne is not the only one getting this treatment, but like there is a restaurant in DC that literally sells buckets of fried chicken and splits of Veuve Clicquot, and like they're pairing fried chicken and champagne.
Awesome.
I mean,
a great pairing, honestly.
Right. And I honestly think Champagne, when I take people on cheese tours of Paris, I tell them, when in doubt, if you can't figure out what to pair with your cheese, Champagne is always going to go. And I'm just sort of wondering, are we seeing that trend happening in France or in Paris, where people are saying, yeah, open your great Champagne and have it with tacos or have it with whatever it is that you want to eat. Don't feel like you need to have, like you said, Christian, the caviar and the oysters and the biscuit de Reims.
I think in our world, we're all saying that. I think consumers are catching up, and some people have definitely embraced it. But I think for a lot of people, if they're only drinking, Champagne, once a year. I mean, do you know that 2/3 of Americans buy 1 bottle of sparkling a year? Not even Champagne, sparkling. When everyone's favorite, New Year's Eve.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have situations where people are so like, for us, we could have like, hey, let's like crack open a bottle of champagne because, it's Thursday, I'd be like, yeah, let's like roast a chicken, let's like, just put out some charcuterie. Let's just have something like super easy and like super cool. That's pretty much like our plan, like all the time when we drink champagne. But for a lot of people, because it's always, Champagne is consumed in these very rarefied situations. It's like, well, it's New Year's Eve, so everyone's dressed up and we have to have this and we have to have that. So people are starting to drink more sparkling and more champagne in general. And I think that what we're seeing alongside of that is people realizing that you don't have to serve it with these crazy things. Plus, also, most people in the world have never tasted caviar or lobster like in their lives. So it's kind of funny. And I always say, being like quite prolo in the way that I approach things, is I'm like, if you've already shelled out like the $50 for the bottle of champagne, you probably don't have an extra like 50 laying around for the caviar and another 100 for the lobster. So I think that we need to continue to work. And again, some people want to keep champagne consumption and Burgundy consumption and Barolo consumption, in these rarefied like situations. But I don't know. I think we can still honor these great wines and respect these great wines, but just, make it a little bit easier to appreciate and a little bit more fun and spontaneous.
Now, if you guys know me at all, you know that I'm a little woo-woo. I'm a little woo-woo up in here. So if you're a little woo-woo too, you need to make sure to check out Annette Deloux's podcast, The Heart of You, on the Paris Underground Radio. Annette goes into everything spiritual, and it's been just a blast. Now it's time for a word from the sponsors of the podcast. Now, back to the Terroir podcast.
And I think we've touched on a lot of things that are evolving and changing and making Champagne a little bit less stodgy these days and making it feel a little more approachable. But in addition to all of the wonderful things we've talked about. Are you identifying any other trends that you're seeing in champagne that you think are particularly exciting that people should be keeping their eyes on?
I mean, I think that what people are seeing a lot of in champagne is this something that really polarizes like a lot of people. And I have to say that as a classic guy for a while about this, I struggled with it, but now I'm completely fine with it, is that the worlds of sommeliers and bartenders have collided like more than ever. I mean, Vinexpo Wine Paris in February, I mean, have this massive space dedicated to cocktails at the largest wine show like in the world. And you see bartenders coming out to Champagne all the time, eager to learn, eager to, adapt to new ingredients. You have bartenders doing ateliers like at some of the really big, champagne houses. Champagne's being marketed specifically towards them, like as, whiskey or vermouth would be. So that's really quite cool. And I have a really good friend, Don Davies, who runs the Whiskey Exchange in the UK, and they specialize in super amazing whiskeys and rums and champagne. And like they have this it's almost like this cross-pollination of like the same customer, which is quite cool. I think another thing in champagne is that people are more interested in sort of being hands-on. I have one producer that I like very much. They're in the southern slopes of the Côte Blanc in a little village, Premier Cru, called Berger-les-Vertus. It's this Franco-Swedish producer called Hat and Sonar. They're quite cool. And the thing they do is they do this thing called personal vintage, where you as a doctor from Philadelphia, you as a carpenter from London, you come over with like a bunch of friends and you meet up with Céline Valois, the chef de cave, who's young and cool and awesome, and you basically blend your own champagne, and then it's bottled and put downstairs in the cellar, and then 4 years later it's delivered to you with your own label on it, so you can kind of be like, hey, I took a hand trying to make my own champagne. Chateau Lynchbage down in Bordeaux is doing this, a very similar thing with their Venive project, where, a bunch of friends come over and like blend their own like Bordeaux. And, they're not trained winemakers, but at least they can understand, oh, wow, like that's what Vin Clair are. Oh, wow, that's the difference between vinifying in stainless steel or vinifying like in oak, small oak, big oak. Oh, that's what different dosage levels actually mean. So I think there's this real openness to that, because consumers that love wine, like they want to actually make their own thing, do their own thing, and learn. And it should all be about education. And so I think that, yeah, it just goes along with what we were saying before. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on in Champagne, and trends like that, I think let's let them continue.
Awesome. I mean, I think we've touched on so many amazing points. I think we are bringing life back into a region that a lot of people want to put in a museum, which is so unfortunate because wine's alive, terroir's alive, we're alive. So let's drink champagne, right?
For now.
Well,
If Christian keeps doing the good work he's doing on climate change, we will all be okay, right?
I am a mere one person, but I think that all of us need to be working on it together. And I think that obviously Champagne is a place that's very, very close to my heart. So anything I can do to draw attention to Champagne is always wonderful. But, I mean, let's keep this climate conversation going. We're starting to see a lot of interest in it from all over the world. So I think the IWCA, we have like a very rich future ahead of us. And we have more and more producers every day that are saying, how can I be involved? How can I be involved? That are open to being audited, that are opening to actually, having their emissions actually reported, sharing best practices, mitigating collective carbon footprint in line with the scientific community. I mean, the whole thing should be based on science. So I think that's quite cool that people are starting to really care about that.
I totally agree. And, if you're listening and you want to be impactful in this particular way, the answer is to just try to be a little more informed about your wine. Google it. And it's a little easier usually to find wines that are Googleable in a shop rather than the supermarket. But there are, especially with champagne, there's amazing champagnes at the supermarket, especially here in France, but in the US too. Google it, see what they say about it. If they don't say anything about it, that's probably odd these days, honestly. I think any good wine brand, they do care about this because like we said at the very beginning, it is everybody's problem.
Christian, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us all of this amazing information. I'm sure all the champagne fiends at home are super psyched to start drinking more often than on January 1st or the 31st of December, which is when traditionally you would drink your champagne. Where can people find you if they want to know more about all this awesome stuff you've been sharing with us?
I mean, Instagram for sure. I'm really easy to find. I'm Bosie Champagne, so Bosie Champagne. And I'm pretty easy and accessible. And anyone who has questions about champagne or International Wineries for Climate Action or anything that we've talked about, I mean, definitely reach out for me.
Can I come visit you?
Sure.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. This has been really interesting and educational. And listeners, go buy a bottle of champagne and drink it with your dinner on a Tuesday night because it goes with everything.
And tag us on the Instagram.
Yeah.
Let us know what you're drinking and what you're pairing it with.
And make sure you're following me and Emily. I'm Wine Dine Caroline. Emily is Emily_in_France, the original Emily in Paris. Thank you guys so much. And Christian, thank you so much for being with us.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me and hope to see you very soon.
This episode of the Terroir podcast was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.